I'm Scott Allen Miller. It's the 10th of June, 2023. This is my vlog of daily life living in Nicaragua, and today we're going to do kind of a little bit of a recap of 2.5 years here in Nicaragua. I'll see you after the bump. So today I decided I wanted to do a little bit of a recap and give you guys kind of a feeling for where we are here in Nicaragua, not meaning here in León, which we are, but what it's been like for 2.5 years here. And to give a little bit of background, I think it's important to go through a little bit of where we've lived over the years. I grew up in upstate New York and lived in the same place for 18 years. I then moved to Michigan for a couple of years, came back, moved to Rochester, New York. I had grown up in the country. I lived in the city for a little while, then moved to Pittsburgh temporarily, then to Ithaca, New York, where I met my wife, Dominica. We then lived in Ithaca for a couple of years. That was kind of our home base for a long time, and we really thought of it as home. At the time, we ended up moving back home because my mother was sick and lived for several years in Geneseo, New York. This actually felt a bit like home because I was going back home. If you were to stand on the roof of the first house that we owned there and look out across the valley, you pretty much could see the farmhouse where I grew up. So we were very close to home in that regards for me, and we had a house just a few blocks away from where my wife had gone to university and where her sorority house had been. So she was very attached to the town as well. So we had a lot of history in that town and owned our first house there together and had it for many years. That really felt like home. We made a big investment in that community. We worked there, we lived there, we built our house there. Our house was partially custom made for us. We got our first pets there, so many things. And that location has a certain pull for us that it still feels like home. And for the last few years, my father has lived directly behind that house in an apartment. So going to his apartment feels like we're going back to our old house, more or less. We've continued to have an attachment to that very specific location for a long time. I think of all the places that we've lived over the years, at least for me, that one felt the most like home. At no point did it ever really feel like something we were going to leave. And when we ended up selling that house, it wasn't because we wanted to get rid of it. It's because I was working on Wall Street. We were living in New Jersey, and someone made an offer on the house that was so good that it just made sense to sell it because we had not been using it that much at that point. And we had never planned to sell it, but when the money came up, we said, well, we don't know when we're going to use it again in a real way. It just made sense to sell it. And we're glad that we did. But that was the one house we really, truly loved over the years. And it was the one house that we lived in with absolutely no plans of ever moving on to another house. It simply was the house that we had chosen. And it was fantastic. It was comfortable. It was new. It had enough space for us. However, once we started having children, it would have been a major problem. It did not have the space for kids at all. But we were young. We were in our 20s when we got it. We then moved on and spent a few years, about 2.5 years, living in northern New Jersey. When we got pregnant with our first daughter, we didn't know it was our daughter at the time, we quickly moved to downstate New York in the Hudson Valley. And this began us moving around a little bit. We lived there for only 1.5 years, but we owned the house there. So we ended up keeping the house for more than a decade. But we pretty quickly moved on to Dallas, Texas, where we rented briefly while shopping for a house. And we ended up owning a house in Dallas for quite a bit more than a decade as well. And so those two houses remained in our possession for a very long time, since just before our eldest daughter was born until just about 2 years ago. So those houses have a certain amount of long-term longevity in our minds and our memories. However, the one in the Hudson Valley, we lived there for 1.5 years. Then we moved to Texas. We put in about 3.5 years living in Texas. And then we ended up moving back to that house in New York, in southern New York, for another 1.5 years. So we actually put in a total of 3 years living in that house, but it was broken up so much. Our kids don't feel like it was that much time. It was very brief, and it always seemed like it was temporary, both the original time and the second time. Even though we kept the house for a really long time, it was simply because we couldn't sell it, not because we wanted to keep it or that it particularly felt like home. I was thinking about this all last night, and it was running through my mind these memories. It's a little bit weird that I've moved around so much over the years that looking back on the house in Geneseo, I have such fond memories of that. It feels like home in many ways. And looking at the house in Peekskill, when we lived there, it was a really cool experience, but it always felt a lot like an apartment, but one that was super important because it was the house where we got pregnant and had our first baby. And Luciana, our second, lived there when she was very, very young. It is the house where she fell down the stairs. We have a lot of memories, good and bad, from that particular house. And it was such an important part of our lives because it was such a money pit for so long that it was always something we were thinking of. However, going back to it, I would have a hard time finding it again, right? I spent so little time there, and it has been so long since I visited it that it feels like a far off place, almost like a place I never really lived. But I did really like living so close to Manhattan. I liked being able to jump on the train and go into the office. It was all very magical. It was a really neat experience to get to live there, and it's weird for me to think that we actually spent 3 years of our lives living there. That was a significant amount of time. At no point does it feel like that in my memory. Even though we spent the majority of the time that we were pregnant with Liesel with that house, it's hard to remember. And most of my memories are just when she was a tiny baby or when we were waiting to go to the hospital to have her. But other than that, that house always felt temporary. It always felt very, very fast. The house that we had the longest that we actually lived in is the house in Texas, in Carrollton, Texas. We had a house that was very practical there, and we liked it quite a lot. And that is the house where Luciana was born, not in the house, but we were living there when she was born, and where she did most of her growing up, other than the little bit of time in Peekskill, New York. And so that house has even more memories, and we had for so much longer. But we lived there for about 3 years before moving back to the house in Peekskill. And when we left Peekskill, we ended up moving to Europe, and then we bounced around as our visas would allow throughout Europe and Central America for a number of years. Eventually, we ended up, due to the course of events, moving back to the house in Carrollton, Texas for another few years, for another 3 years, starting in late 2017 through the beginning of, through 2020. And so it managed to be, somewhat accidentally, the house that we lived in far more than anywhere else. However, we did so much work to it that the house that we moved into and the house that we moved out of almost didn't seem like the same house. My memories from when Luciana was being born in our carpeted house with all the open windows and one set of colors and just all these things and different furniture compared to the house that we left when she was only 9 or 10 years old, and with all those different changes in between, was hardwoods and different colors, and the windows were always closed. And it was a very different place. And we updated the house so much to sell it for the last few years. We were planning on selling it for so long, but COVID hit, and that kept us in the house for years longer than we intended. We had not meant to move back from Europe. That was just the course of events led us to that. And so it never really solidified as a place that we were permanently in. It always felt like, yes, Texas was kind of our base, and we meant it to be the place where we raised the kids and to be the place we would go to and from. But during the time we lived in Europe, we had no plans to return to that house, and only did so because we were kind of forced into it at one point. And so for a really long time, we never really had a strong sense of home. And I worry that my children have that same feeling as well, that we moved so often and they kept going. Luckily, they went to and from the same places a few times. Liesel kept moving back to a house she had lived in before and so forth. So it gives a little bit more of a solid feeling, but there was a lot of just moving. And all throughout my adult life, before I met my wife, I was moving constantly as well. So I've always been a bit of a nomad. And that brings us to, in early 2021, moving to Nicaragua. Now, it's important to note, and I've said this before, we lived in Nicaragua briefly in 2015. I then spent a bit of time here visiting in 2019. In late 2019, we made the decision that this was likely where we were coming back to. During 2020, we worked really hard to actually make that come to fruition. And so all through 2020, our minds were that Nicaragua was going to be our home, at least for the near future. And by the beginning of 2021, we were already in motion to come down. We really had things in pretty solid motion by late 2020. So the house in Texas was being ready for sale starting in 2019. All of 2020 was about moving down. and we were down here right at the beginning of 2021. Paul came down first. We had already purchased a place, and that was after we had already purchased another place. So Paul and I are here in super early 2021. We then returned, having had the first place that we purchased fall through, purchased another, came back, and so we've been really active here essentially since late 2019. We just had a break because of COVID. We got stuck outside the country is basically what happened. So mentally, we've kind of been here since 2019. But physically since beginning of 2021. And that puts us now at 2.5 years here. And I think what's worth noting more than anything is that even though we've only been here roughly the same length or a little bit shorter than we were in the house in Geneseo, New York, in the house in Peekskill, New York, of either of the times that we did in Texas or the amount of time that we spent living in Europe, we've now been here a similar amount of time. But unlike all of those places that at that point we were clearly sensing that we were moving on, we were clearly feeling like it was temporary, like we were investing only if it was to sell a place to be able to move on to the next thing. Here in Nicaragua, it feels like we're just ramping up to a long future of being based here. So for us, this is a unique thing in our lives that Nicaragua feels like permanence. Maybe not the house that we're in now, maybe it is, and maybe not the city of León, but probably. But Nicaragua in general, more than anywhere else that we've lived, we have created a community of friends. We've had friends everywhere that we lived. Peekskill actually possibly on the verge of an exception to that. We almost never met people in downstate New York. It just never happened. You never meet your neighbors. We would, but very little. Once in a while we talked to the neighbor. We were so just inside our house, and something about the nature of the house that we had there and the community that we were in just made it that meeting other people, talking to people outside the house just wasn't a thing that came up. The time that we would meet people most is when we took the kids to the playground, and it was rare that people would talk to you there, but sometimes you had multiple kids at the playground and you're like, oh, how are your kids doing, right? But it was not a great way to make communal friends. Here in Nicaragua, we already have so many friends. We have such a big group, so much bigger than we ever had in any of the other places that we lived. Clearly, by the end of living in Texas, we had amassed a lot of friends, and we missed them dearly. But it took a long time to put together that number of friends, and we were younger then. It was easier to meet people. We had more effort, more energy, more time to go out. Doing the same thing now, 12, 13 years older, is more challenging, but it's happening here. And we have friends at the beach, we have friends in the city, we have friends around the country, we have friends who move here, friends who visit. It's a very different experience, and it really, really feels like home in a way that I don't think anywhere else has. Now, it's worth noting also that, having lived in Europe, if you ask me where physically feels the most home, ignoring the actual people and places, but just arriving at a place, and pretty clearly for me, Spain feels the most like home to me, partially because it's the first country that we ever moved to that has a certain draw, but something about Spain gives me a level of comfort that a lot of other places do not. And for the most part, Western Europe tends to feel very much like home to me, along with the Mediterranean. When we lived in Greece, when we lived in Italy, when we lived in Spain, all of those places had a very strong sense of this feels home-ish to me. Any of them I could instantly settle in and just have that I'm home feeling without too much of a challenge. But Spain more than anywhere. I never had that feeling in Panama or in Romania, places that I love, or in Ukraine. But Romania, I was incredibly comfortable, but it never felt like home. It always had a slightly exotic feel, partially because it was so far east, partially reasons I can't say. But language barrier is certainly a thing, but Greece had a really strong language barrier as well and did not have that feeling of being exotic or remote. But of all those places, there were places that had home feelings and places that didn't. Here in Nicaragua, I think falls into the middle of the places that have those home feelings. But more than anything, it is all the people we know. It is that we know this is home. It's that we know it makes sense for us. We know that this is the place that long term has been and is going to continue being an important part of our lives. It gives a really strong sense of home for us. And it's hard to imagine a future where Nicaragua is not our primary home, or at very least our secondary home, where we're here all the time, just regularly coming and going. when I came back in 2019, my first time going back to a country I had lived in a significant way. I had gone back to, when we lived in Spain, we had visited previously, but it was visited and then lived in. We have not, at the time, very little going back to Spain or where we lived. I went back to Spain, but Barcelona, very far from where we lived. Later, I went back to Italy, but very far from where we lived. I went back to Greece and actually was right next to the places that we lived in, also in 2019. We had lived there in 2016, and it was a really special experience to be able to go back to basically the same place. I went back to some like the old bakery that I used to go to, and that was really special. It really was cool going back and being like, wow, I'm so connected to this place. I miss it. I love the island of Crete. It's fantastic. But coming back to Nicaragua was a bit different in that I was back for a bit of time. I went back and saw my old house, and that was 2019, and it really felt special landing again. It was like, oh, I'm back. And instantly, those distant memories of Nicaragua became current memories again in a very concrete way. And when we moved back, it felt like we were coming back home. It didn't feel like going to an exotic place. It didn't feel like going to a remote place. It felt like home-ish. It's hard to explain exactly how the feeling was different than going to like Spain or Greece, but there certainly was a feeling of this is where I belong. Perhaps less of that perfect fit in the way that Spain or Greece or Northern Italy give me that feeling, but more of a, for whatever is the set of circumstances we have, this is the place that ends up being home. And definitely by the time we came here in 2021, that feeling was really, really strong that this is where we were meant to be. So when we arrived in 2021, our adventure began by kind of accidentally purchasing a hotel out on the beach here in León. We did not come down with the intention of running a hotel. Now, we've always wanted to. Dominic and I have worked in hotels previously. We had always said it would be something we would like to do. We've talked about doing it since we were very first married. It's always been on our radar, but we didn't come here with that in mind. We thought we were buying a house that had been converted to a hotel that we were going to convert back to a house. And when we arrived, the hotel ended up being something that was running, and we really enjoyed it as a hotel, and we decided to give it a go as hoteliers, and then tried living in the hotel for the first year. That was really interesting and cool, and I'm glad that we did because it gave us a really firm attachment to the beach and the beach community in our village there. We got to know a lot of people, and we became important members of the beach where we are very strongly tied. Then we decided that we needed to move into the city because we do more things in the city. We have a lot of just business back and forth. It just makes more sense for us to live away from the hotel. If you're interested in living on the beach, great. Like, I'm not trying to talk anyone out of that. It's not living on the beach that we found to be a problem. It was being hoteliers and restaurateurs on a small beach and living on that beach. We're so visible, so recognizable, and we like being out and about so much that we were way too much in the public eye at all times. It was more than we could handle. And for the dogs, the beach was not ideal because they really need to be walked a lot. They're young, and where we lived on the sand, it's just all kinds of wild dogs there. It's just a lot of complications. So for us, moving into the city made a lot of sense, but we wanted to be close to our place on the beach, and so we moved into León, and it's only about 15-20 minutes away, and that ended up being really perfect. Over time, we decided that living slightly out in the suburbs on the way towards the beach was the thing that made the most sense, and that is why we're here in this garden paradise. This is where it has ended up being the place that makes sense for us the most. And I can say with a lot of assurance that having lived in the city proper, having lived on the beach, that being in between for us, this is what makes sense. We're close enough to the city that going in is easy. We're close enough that taking a taxi is easy. We're close enough that it is not expensive to go in. But we're also on the beach side, and going out to the beach is really easy. And it just gives us the mix of things that we need. And we love having dogs, and our dogs need a lot of space. And this lets them run and be happy and healthy. And it's been fantastic. And we like that it's cooler and that we have space, and it gives us an amount of privacy because we're surrounded by high walls and we have a nice garden and we can hang out and be outside and enjoy being outside, but being business owners in the area and being extranjeros, foreigners in the area, means that if we were to sit out on the sidewalk like Nicaraguans do, we would be extremely visible. We would be so much of just everyone keeping their eye on us, and so many people would stop by and want to talk with us, and we love that people want to do that, right? In no way is that a negative, but when you live in a place like León that is so large that there's like an endless number of people, but so small that it feels like you're always in a village and everyone knows who you are, having the ability for people to just walk up and talk to you at any moment is overwhelming. You have to be full of free time and willing to just hang out and talk to anyone who shows up at any time, which would be great. But the last thing I have is free time. As many of you know, I work a full-time consulting job. Like full time, right? I typically put in 60 to 80 hours a week. A lot of that is technical. I have to be extremely focused. Every interruption to my day is an extreme problem for me. I do not handle interruptions well. A lot of my staff's jobs are simply to keep me from being interrupted. One of the reasons that we have a chef is because I cannot go get myself a snack. I can't. I have to be able to say, I'm hungry, give me this, right? And she runs in with a sandwich for me, and she brings me coffee in the morning, right? That stuff's really important. We have people who manage the house to make sure that when construction work is being done, that someone's overseeing it and I don't have to be interrupted. And right now with Paul gone, I have to deal with all the runs to the bank, and it's killing me. Every bit of errands that I have to run, absolutely crippling to me. So for me, having a quiet place that is as isolated as we can get within reason is really important, because I would love to talk to everybody. I absolutely love all the visitors. I love every time you guys show up and say, let's get dinner or let's get coffee or something. Fantastic. I love doing that stuff, right? I love when you guys are like, let's get on the phone. I want to do an hour consultation, right? I love doing that stuff. Like, it makes me happy. That's why I charge a fraction of what I bill for when I'm a normal consultant, right? And everyone complains, you're losing money doing this. I'm like, but this is fun. Like, this lets me relax a bit, right? While not making zero money or whatever. But it's really easy for people to start showing up and being like, I see Scott's here, right? If I go out to the beach, instantly I have people showing up and hanging out, which I love, but I have to be able to leave the beach and not have that happen. And so that's why we're out here. If you're retired or you don't care about interruptions and you're happy to have people stop by all day long and hang out, then absolutely, you can do that. I am not retired. I work a crazy amount of hours, and that's just my consulting job. I then do all my side projects and this vlog. And in case you have not been watching this vlog for a long time, this vlog takes a lot of work to make. I spend an hour or more recording every day, and then 3 to 4 hours editing every day. And if you're not familiar, this is not my only channel. On YouTube, we also work with Nicaragua 360, which takes much less effort for sure, but a few times a week I try to put out beautiful 360 videos of Nicaragua. That takes a lot less time than this channel, but not nothing, right? I'm putting a few hours into recording every week and a few hours into editing every week, so that adds on. And Drive Warp, similarly, I tend to record when I'm doing other things, but it's extra stuff and I have to edit, and everything that I record and edit also has a lot of file management. So like right now I'm on my GoPro 9, but my GoPro 11 is plugged in and uploading all the videos from yesterday right now. So like, I have to manage that all day long. I have to make sure everything gets backed up, everything gets edited, everything gets cataloged. There's so many videos because of all these different channels. And if you haven't checked it out, I also have Camera Cafe, which I hope to record some new material for tomorrow. I'm really behind on new ones for that, and it does seem to be kind of popular, where I just talk about cameras because I love cameras. I have a lot of hobbies, a lot of things that I'm interested in, and any minute friends are showing up because we're playing Dungeons and Dragons out here with the kids. It's a great family time. That's another activity we have going on, and all these things require time and focus, and so all those interruptions are really problematic for me. So for us, being isolated because we're so visible is a really big deal, and it's something to consider how that will affect your life, certainly if you're looking at moving to Nicaragua. So all of that is kind of a background to say that at this point, after 2.5 years here in Nicaragua, I know a lot of you watch my show all the time, and a lot of you are going to be like, look, we know what's coming, like there's no surprises. We are loving life in Nicaragua. We have been here long enough now, however, that we're starting to get the itch to travel. And so Paul and Dominica are traveling right now. I currently have some pretty solidified plans to be heading to South America in September. These dogs are so funny. This is how happy they are out in the garden. They just love to play and they love to hang out while I'm recording. And so we're starting to get that. So for our first couple years living here, we really wanted to enjoy Nicaragua, and we had so much of like just being excited being here. Being here for the first couple of years felt like travel. It was like everyday travel going on. And now that we've been here pushing 3 years, it's starting to feel like home, which is fantastic, right? That is absolutely amazing that this is starting to feel like home. But because this is starting to feel like home, it's not feeling like travel anymore, and that's making us want to get out and actually travel other places and come back here. But what's so exciting is that this is where we get to come back to. It used to be that we would travel, and when we came back, we'd go back to Texas. And while we liked Texas for being the US, it was not exotic, it was not fun, it was not exciting, it was just a decent place to have a house. Coming back to Nicaragua is actually a place that we're going to look forward to coming back to, be excited to go back and be in Nicaragua for a while. My desire to travel is so much less because I live here, not because I dislike traveling more than I used to. I love traveling. It's like my favorite activity. But I also really love just being in Nicaragua. Every day makes me happy. I like going to the bar. I like going to restaurants. I like going to shows. I like listening to music. I like hanging out with friends here. I like the life that we get to have living in Nicaragua. So because coming home is so great, it makes it less of a bit of pressure to get out and travel. Most importantly for all of us, including the kids, Nicaragua is feeling like home. For the first year and for all the time leading up to moving down here permanently, my kids always said, yeah, we'd love to live abroad, but long term we plan to live in Texas. Now they say they have no interest in moving back. They love it here. This is where they plan on making their long-term lives. They don't know exactly where in Nicaragua. They don't know whether they want houses or apartments or whatever, but their plans are that this is their home. This is where they want to stay. This is where they're comfortable. This is where they feel safe, which is fantastic. And that is the feeling we all have, that this now really feels like home. It feels like a place we are attached to. It makes me comfortable when I say this is where we plan to be for the rest of our lives, at least secondarily, if not the only place that we are. That's a great feeling to have because it makes us happy to say that. In the past, saying things like that in Texas gives you kind of a terrible feeling. Not that Texas is bad. It was my favorite place in the US, but it always made me feel like I don't want that to be the answer. That made me unhappy. But having this as the answer makes me happy. Had to take a bit of a break there because our friend showed up to play Dungeons and Dragons, which highlights our life here. We have friends who come over and play D&D with the kids, and this is a thing we do every week. And while we were playing, we had a bunch of friends who were out at Rustic, and a friend of ours was performing, and friends were there watching them perform, and our group here was texting the group there with pictures of what was going on. And we have so many people who are doing things so much, and we had this awesome evening. We actually played 9 hours of D&D. Our friends got here at 3 o'clock and we played till midnight. And I'm now racing to get this video out for you guys. So I'm actually recording this last thing just a few hours before it gets uploaded for you. But I think the recap, I don't want this to go on forever, is after having been here for 2.5 years, our realization is that Nicaragua is actually better than we anticipated. Even with our experiences here, knowing what we did before we came, having lived here previously, having visited a couple of times in between, we had high hopes for Nicaragua, and Nicaragua has exceeded them in that time since we've been here. We are continuously falling in love with the country more and more as we are here. And we keep running into problems, right? Any place you live, you're going to run into problems in life, and you associate them with the place that you live. And I think when you move to a new place, when you run into something complicated, you're like, oh, it's that place. And if I was in my old place, that wouldn't have happened. And maybe it wouldn't have, but something else would have, right? But when you're in your home country and something bad happens, right? Car accident or something, you don't think, oh, this is because of traffic laws in this country, or it's because of the way they police, or it's because of drivers here, right? Sometimes you do, but in general you don't, right? You think it's just a traffic problem. It's isolated from the place that you live. Traffic can be bad. When you live in a new place, you tend to associate every problem with the fact that it's a new place. It's just human nature. It's how we do things. Even with all of that, even with the little things that we run into, overall, we just consistently find that we are happier. We love being here. I'm able to make this channel about living here every day because it's exciting, because I'm enjoying it because there's so many interesting things that happen. And for me, the challenges of living in a new place are important. And I talked about this in videos when we said, why did we want to move here, right? Being forced to learn a new language, being forced to get a little bit outside my comfort zone, do new things, eat new food, go new places, learn to speak a new language. All those things help make the everyday more exciting, and Nicaragua has really lived up to that, not just in a challenging way. The excitement of finding so many friends, finding so many people that we hang out with, finding so many activities that we love to do, and learning how to have the lives that we really want while living here, and so often in ways that we weren't able to do back home, whether it was just because it was too expensive or because the things were not available to us, or the lifestyle didn't exist, or whatever. And raising children here has been so great, and they're loving it so much, right? They're loving that we were able to play D&D. They're loving that they have a safe place to live, and the food, and everything. And it's been this really great experience for everybody. If you had asked 3 years ago, when you go and you're there for a few years and you do a recap, what's it going to be like? I think very likely I would have said, well, I think we'll still like it. I think it'll be fine. I think we'll be itching to move on to the next place. We'll be thinking of it as a home base potentially, but not as our main location, not as it'll be okay. Right? And that was a lot of the discussion when we first came down, was we need to find a place that's as good as we can estimate that we're looking for, that's good enough to make it as a base while we look for something else. And very quickly, I think that changed. We got here and we all said, we really don't need to be looking for something else. This is actually where we potentially want to be. Like, this really is not a stepping stone. This really is, because for years, for a decade, my wife and I were searching for where did we want our permanent home to be. When we were able to move any place that we wanted, where was that going to be? And we often thought that would be in Europe, right? Long, we thought Spain, Italy, maybe Greece. Those were always our main targets. And Central America was always on the list of, yeah, it could be. But we were expecting it, one, to be further in the future, and to have slightly different factors, and just didn't expect Latin America to come up as high. We just kept expecting Europe to be the slam dunk of where we wanted to live, and certainly we love it very much. And at the end of the day, now that we're here and put in time, it's become home in a way that isn't going away, in a way that keeps becoming more home day by day. The longer we're here, the more it feels like, well, I don't want to be somewhere else. This is where so many friends are. This is where so many activities are. This is where our dogs are. This is where we like to be based. This is where we feel comfortable. And that was not what we really predicted. But I think it's the answer that's important. For people who are wondering, what are you going to find when you come here? Of course, your experiences will be different, and the things that you like will be different. But we weren't people who were like, Nicaragua's the place. We know Nicaragua's the place. We're going to get there. It's all going to be perfect. We didn't know that when we came. We knew it was good enough. We knew it would work. We didn't know that we were just going to be like, this is it. We certainly didn't know that our kids were going to be like, no, this is it. Right? Everything just kind of came together, and it has been such an amazing experience. So thank you to all of our friends and family and everyone who has been so great here, and to the country of Nicaragua, and thank you for allowing us to live here. It really is a great privilege for us, and a great experience, and it makes me happy that we're able to use this channel and others to share not just information, but our passion about what we've discovered here with everyone. So thanks for joining me. Like and subscribe if you'd like to support the channel, all the things. I will see all of you tomorrow.